Here are some quick notes on hydrogen burning to accompany Chapter 5 of To Build a Star. So in a star, you can burn hydrogen a couple different ways, but one of the main ones in the sun is through the so-called proton-proton chains, or for short, the PP chains, as you'll often hear said. So basically you start out with hydrogen, and so you have a couple of protons, and they can burn one of two ways. And most of the time what's happening is they're combining. A weak reaction is simultaneously happening, so basically one of your protons is beta decaying, and you form deuterium, and that's the main thing you care about here. A small fraction of the time, an electron can simultaneously collide with the two protons, and you can undergo an electron capture and get your weak reaction that way. Then you have your deuterium fused with a proton to make helium-3, and now is where you can branch out into one of the three proton-proton chains. And what's shown here are the percentages at the temperature of the center of the sun. So this is at 15 megakelvin, 150 grams per centimeter cubed, so solar central conditions. So once you have your helium-3, the majority of the time in the sun, you're going to fuse those helium-3 nuclei, boom, make your helium-4, and that's it. That's your pp1 chain. You've taken 4 protons, and you've converted them to a helium nucleus. And you might say, okay, wait a second, how do you get 4? Well, you have 1, 2, 3, and then that's to make one helium-3, you have to make a second one, so that's 6. And so then you also spit out 2 protons, so 6 minus 2 is 4. So 4 protons becomes a helium nucleus. Now in the sun, a much smaller fraction of the time, instead you can have helium-3 alpha gamma. So your helium-3 captures your helium-4, and then you make beryllium-7. And then you can branch out into either the pp2 or the pp3 chain. So the vast majority of the time, the beryllium-7 will undergo electron capture, and then that lithium-7 will capture a proton. And again, if you do the accounting, you get 4 protons become a helium nucleus, or in this case 8 protons become 2 helium nuclei. Very small fraction of the time, instead the beryllium-7 can capture a proton, and that makes boron-8. Boron-8 beta decays to beryllium-8, which splits apart pretty much immediately into 2 alpha particles. And again, if you do the accounting, you'll find that for each helium nucleus, 4 protons went in. So in the sun, this is mostly what happens is the pp1 chain. As you get to hotter temperatures, you can fuse higher Z nuclei, so higher proton number, so the Coulomb barrier isn't as big of a deal. So pp2 becomes more significant at hotter temperatures, and pp3 at hotter temperatures yet. Now, before that, what can kick in at somewhat higher temperatures are the so-called CNO cycles. So there's a few different names you'll see for this. You'll often see this sequence of carbon-13 proton capture, then you have another proton capture, then a beta decay, P alpha, P gamma, beta decay. So here this is the thing you're capturing, this is the thing you're releasing in the nuclear reaction. You'll often see this cycle here labeled the CNO1 cycle or the CN cycle, just the original name. And then the CN2 cycle is this separate business here where you have nitrogen 14, and then you do P alpha beta decay, P gamma beta decay, and you wind up back here. So this is the CNO2 cycle, and often you'll see this labeled as the CNO bicycle, because really if you have CNO2 occurring, which is at slightly hotter temperatures than CNO1, then in reality you have both cycles kind of interacting. And this happens a little bit in the sun, this CN cycle, but it tends to happen at slightly hotter temperatures. These are also sometimes called the cold CNO cycles, because as we'll see in a moment, a different reaction sequence can happen when you're at higher temperatures. So in the solar conditions, roughly 1% of all hydrogen fusion happens due to this CNO1 cycle, and 0.07% of all of the hydrogen fusion in the sun is from this CNO2 part of the bicycle. So you can look at the energy release in solar luminosity versus the temperature, and you see that this circle here, this is solar luminosity. So the PP chain is still the dominant means of energy production. If you go to a slightly more luminous star, so slightly hotter solar core, you go from 15 megakelvin to say 20 megakelvin, then that's when the CN cycle begins to dominate. And so in massive stars, this is the predominant mechanism of energy generation when you're on the main sequence, when your core is converting hydrogen into helium. For stars around the solar mass and less, the PP chain is what is dominant. Okay, so interestingly, these hydrogen burning sequences give us a signature that allow us to peer into the solar core. So as you've seen in the past, you can't see photons from very far into the sun at all. You can do helioseismology, where you look at basically Doppler shift of absorption lines to determine waves on the surface of the sun, and you can use those along with modeling to peer into the inner solar structure. But neutrinos give you really a way to look directly into the center of the sun. And these neutrinos are from those sequences of nuclear reactions that we just discussed. And so you can look here at the neutrino flux versus neutrino energy. So the PP chains, these are the black lines that you see here. Anytime you see a continuum, that's because you have a beta decay going on. Anytime you see a sharp line, that is an electron capture. So remember, beta decay is a three-body process. So you're splitting the electron, or the energy rather, between an electron and a neutrino. And so you have a continuum. When you do electron capture, you release a neutrino at a very sharp energy. So there's the PP chains, and then the CNO cycle neutrinos are shown with the red lines here. So again, electron captures are sharp spikes, and then you have beta decays. Because the CNO cycle is only about 1% of the energy generation in the center of the sun, it actually was only this year that the CNO cycle neutrinos were detected in the sun. So this paper isn't even published yet, but it has been vetted significantly, so I would assume that the results will hold. So this is from the Borax-Xeno collaboration. What they have is a just absolutely massive liquid scintillator. So basically 500,000 pounds of liquid scintillator, over 2,000 photomultiplier tubes, and what happens is a neutrino comes from the sun. It's produced in the center of the sun in a nuclear reaction. About 8 minutes later, a neutrino will scatter off an electron. That electron moving in the liquid scintillator will produce light collected by the photomultiplier tubes. You can histogram those light signals. So how many light signals do you have as a function of energy? You get this spectrum, that's the data points, and if you want to reproduce this spectrum, you need to introduce this red curve here, which is the CNO cycle neutrinos. And so these were detected, recently. So this paper just came out about a month ago, so you're learning about this hot off the press thing, but in any case, it's some proof that this is what's going on at the center of the sun. Now, other than just cool, we can see neutrinos, the signature of nuclear reactions at the center of the sun. That's cool, obvious direct evidence that stars are basically nuclear fusion reactors. But also you can use these neutrinos to figure out what the temperature at the center of the sun is. Right? So as long as you know the different nuclear reactions, the reaction rates well, which we can measure on the surface of the Earth, then you can figure out, okay, we can measure, for instance, how many boron-8 neutrinos or PP neutrinos we have. And if you measure those, the different proportions are going to tell you what the temperature is at the center of the sun. And so that gives an independent check compared to solar models and compared to helioseismology for conditions at the center of the sun. And this is some key information to help us resolve the solar modeling problem that was brought up in the oscillator strengths quick notes. Okay, so if you crank up the temperature, you can do different types of hydrogen burning. So the main sequence star conditions, you're typically at tens of megakelvin, roughly. and density is on the order of 100 times the density of water, so 100 grams per centimeter cubed. But there are plenty of environments that are quite a bit hotter. So asymptotic giant branch stars where you have shell hydrogen burning going on. Novae, these are explosions on the surface of accreting white dwarf stars. You have even higher temperatures. So now you're at like 100 megakelvin and densities that are like 1,000 times the density of water. And even more extreme, you can get to X-ray bursts, where you're accreting hydrogen onto the surface of a neutron star, which we'll talk about in a couple chapters. And then you get densities to 1,000,000 times the density of water and 1,000,000,000 degrees Kelvin. So what happens when you crank up the temperature is you go beyond the CNO cycles to the hot CNO cycles. So these are shown here on the nuclear chart. So each box is an isotope. Protons is the vertical direction, neutrons is the horizontal. The gray are just stable isotopes. So at hot, but not crazy hot temperatures, you have hot CNO1 cycle. Once you get up to about, let's say, 500 million degrees and something on the order of 10 to the 5 grams per centimeter cubed, then you can link into the hot CNO2 cycle. So that's just a little bit of extra set of reactions going on. So these are all proton capture reactions and beta decays that are happening here. And then when your conditions reach, something around 1,000,000,000 degrees Kelvin, you can break out of this hot CNO2 cycle. And even in this 500 million degrees, you can also break out of the hot CNO1 cycle. So that's that red line there. So these are your hydrogen burning at hotter temperatures. Now, what's interesting about, or what distinguishes the hot CNO cycle versus the colder CNO cycles, besides that you need higher temperatures for these to occur, is that these are also beta decay limited. So here the temperatures are so hot that once you undergo one proton capture, you pretty much immediately undergo the next one. And you wind up waiting for beta decays. The beta decays are slow here, the slowest reactions in the sequence. And so what happens is material basically piles up wherever you have a beta decay occurring. So oxygen 14 has to beta decay, so you pile up material here. Oxygen 15 has a beta decay, you pile up material there. And then similarly for neon 18. And so these reactions are basically where all the abundance of these hot CNO cycles piles up, and this is where all the action happens. And so one thing we really want to know in nuclear astrophysics is what's this oxygen 14 alpha P rate, what's oxygen 15 alpha gamma, what's neon 18 alpha P. And there's been a lot of work and money invested into trying to figure out what these reaction rates are, and we still don't quite have that problem solved yet. And then finally, when you go to the highest temperatures, you get explosive hydrogen burning. So imagine you have something like an accreting neutron star. You're accreting hydrogen onto the surface of the neutron star. That material is building up. The density is increasing. You're bringing in gravitational potential energy to the surface of the neutron star, and so it's heating up. You're generating energy by the CNO cycle reactions. They have a steep temperature dependence, and so as you get a little bit hotter, the reactions go faster and create more energy. So you start to run away. You get to where the hot CNO cycle kicks in. And then finally, once you reach this around 0.3 gigakelvin, so 0.3 billion degrees, you can finally break out, do those oxygen 15 alpha gamma, neon 18 alpha P reactions we talked about, and boom, you start producing a ton of energy all at once. Specifically, this so-called triple alpha process kicks in, where you have 3 helium nuclei fusing at once, and a whole bunch of energy is released, and you have a thermonuclear explosion on the surface of a neutron star. And you can see this shown here in terms of the abundance as a function of time. So what's shown here is a nuclear chart. The vertical direction is protons, horizontal direction is neutrons. We can watch the temperature as a function of time of this environment and see the abundance here in terms of the mass number, so protons plus neutrons. So you start out with your CNO cycle occurring. You get to where your hot CNO cycle is occurring, and then you have a breakout. Boom, you start to make heavier nuclei around calcium up to nickel, and then finally you can even produce nuclei up to around the tin region, with this explosive hydrogen burning, which is pretty cool. That's called the rapid proton capture process. So lots of interesting hydrogen burning things going on. I just wanted to tell you about. For this class, we're just worried about a star. So the PP chain and the CNO cycle are all we really care about for stars until you get to these extreme stellar conditions. And that is it for these quick notes on hydrogen burning.